الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين ووافقنا توفيق الصالحين وانفعنا بالقرآن والذكر الحكيم اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا بما ينفعنا وزدنا علما يقربنا منك برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت يا حي يا قيوم تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا اللهم أعذنا من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا وأصلح لنا شأننا كله لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم وبعد فقال الإمام فخر الدين الرازي رحمه الله ونفعنا به وبكم. So just continuing on, if you recall, we're doing Tafsir of Surah Al-Kahf, although it's possible people would have forgotten by now, because obviously Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, rahimahullah, after starting off the Tafsir, and going down to ayah number 12, which was talking about the people of the cave, then Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi have gone into like a detour onto talking about the awliya and karamat of awliya, and whether this is possible according to Aqeedah of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So he's done a very extensive, when he said at the beginning, I want to go into depths into this, he really meant it, yeah. So we've covered the last few lessons have been just going more into this. It's like almost like it could be published as a risala in itself, like a study in itself, this commentary that he's gone into. Inshallah, I think if not this week, next week we'll be able to come to the end of that particular intensive discussion that he's gone into. So he started off with giving the proofs from the Quran of miracles of awliya from the Quran, most notably the story of Maryam alayhi salam and the people of the cave. Then he went into examples from the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ has given himself stories of previous Bani Israel and previous people where miracles occurred at the hands of awliya. And then he went into the stories of some of the Sahaba, starting with the Khulafa al-Rashidun and then the other Sahaba. So gave many narrations so far to prove that miracles can take place at the hands of people who are not prophets. So that's where we came up to. Okay, so then then he says, at the end of it, and he also mentioned in the books of the Sufis, you'll find many narrations of karamat. وأما دلائل الأقلية القطعية على جواز الكرامات ما وجوه. So then he's going to go to the next level of evidence, which is what we call rational proof. Rational proofs. So this is always the tartib we take in Islamic sciences. When giving proof for anything, first give the revelation, proof from revelation, and then you'll start with the Quran and then the Hadith, and then Athar of Sahaba, etc. And then you'll go to rational proofs as well. So these are proofs of the aql, proofs that we arrive through reason. Yeah? The aql, or the intellect, is a faculty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given a human being. And it is a faculty of the ruh, the soul, and it is one of the processes that takes place in the aql is what we call reason or reasoning or rational thought. Okay, and this is actually very difficult to define as well, if you try to define it. Most things, a lot of things that we think are very obvious are very difficult to define. in terms of giving precise definitions, things like knowledge, time. All of these things, philosophers have discussed at length. How can we define these things? And it's very difficult to actually pin down a definition. But even though we all know exactly what we mean by those things. So anyway, so now he's going to go into the rational proofs that karamat are permissible or possible. Al-Hujjatul Ula. And he gives, how many does he have? Seven or eight anyway. أن العبد ولي الله قال الله تعالى ألا إن أولياء الله لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون ورب ولي العبد. So it starts by saying, first of all, the slave is wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wali of the slave. Like remember we mentioned before, the word wali in Arabic has both meanings. Yeah, it's one of those words that has both opposite meanings. So the slave is also wali, is referred to as wali of Allah, and Allah is also referred to as wali of the slave. Now when it's the slave, it means sort of, you could say, someone who is, the wali is someone who is close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when referring to Allah, wali means sort of guardian. Yeah, so it's like, it says, and then just to prove that from the Quran that wali applies to both, he says, ألا إن أولياء الله لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. Surely the awliya of Allah, no fear is upon them, and nor do they grieve. So the khawf and the huzn, as I mentioned before, these are the two ways that human beings can become distressed mentally. Yeah, either through anxiety or through sadness or depression. So khawf is anxiety, which is fear, which is always to do with something that can happen in the future. So people feel anxious or fearful of things that may happen in the future. You know, people can go into anxiety, severe panic anxiety about fear of what may happen, and then huzn about sadness or grief about the past, things that have happened in the past. So the Quran says the awliya of Allah, they have no fear and they have no grief, because as the saying goes, a Sufi ibn waqtihi. Yeah, there's different interpretations of that, but one of the meanings is that the Sufi, or the man of Allah, the wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is a person of the present. He's a person of the present moment. Yeah? He's not someone who dwells on the past, because whatever's in the past, he says, قَدَرَ اللَّهُ مَا شَاءَ فَعَلَ. Allah destined it and it happened. And he's not someone who fears the future, because he knows that everything is in the hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The one وَمَن يَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ فَهُوَ حَسْبُهُ. The one who trusts in Allah, Allah is sufficient for him. So this is why the wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a person of the present. He's a person of the present. وَرَبُّ وَلِيُّ الْعَبْدِ. And it says in the Quran, Allahu وَلِيُّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Allah is the wali of those who believe. So that's how the word wali is used in both, from both sides. Surah Al-Baqarah 257. وقال وهو يتولى الصالحين Al-A'raf 196. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said He is the one who befriends the righteous. So the word yatawalla is from wali. Once again, you know, that He takes them on as a guardian friend, as a guardian friend or a patron. وقال إنما وليكم الله ورسوله Al-Ma'idah 55. Your wali, your protecting friend, your guardian is none other than Allah and His Messenger. Is none other than Allah and His Messenger. وَكَفَى بِهِ وَلِيًّا وَكَفَى بِهِ نَصِيرًا. It says in the Quran, He is enough as a guardian friend. We don't need anyone else apart from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a wali. وَقَالَ أَنْتَ مَوْلَانَا. Al-Baqarah 276. Anta Maulana. We say Anta Maulana. Mawla is also from the root word wali. ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ اللَّهَ مَوْلَى الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Surah Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, verse 11. Allah is the Mawla of those who believe. وَالْكَافِرُونَ لَا مَوْلَى لَهُمْ. And the disbelievers, they have no Mawla. In reality, the disbelievers, they have no Mawla, because those they worship other than Allah have no reality. But the believers, they do have a Mawla, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فثبت أن الرب ولي العبد وأن العبد ولي الرب وأيضا الرب حبيب العبد والعبد حبيب الرب. So he says this proves that the Lord is the wali of the slave, and that the slave is the wali of the Rabb. And the Rabb is the beloved of the slave, and the slave is the beloved of the Lord. قال تعالى يحبهم ويحبونه. It says in the Quran, He loves them and they love Him. He loves them and they love Him. Al-Ma'idah 54. وقال والذين آمنوا أشد حبا لله. Those who believe are more greater in their love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. More greater. Referring to those disbelievers who worship idols. But those who believe, the Muslims, are more greater in their love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than those disbelievers are in their love of their idols. وقال إن الله يحب التوابين ويحب المتطهرين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves those who turn to Him in repentance, and He loves those who purify themselves. So, just explaining that one of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He loves the believers. He loves those who come close to Him. وإذا ثبت هذا فنقول العبد إذا بلغ في الطاعة إلى حيث يفعل كل ما أمره الله وكل ما فيه رضاه وترك كل ما نهى الله وزجر عنه فكيف يبعد أن يفعل الرب الرحيم الكريم مرة واحدا ما يريده العبد. So it says, once we've established these facts, and we say the slave, if the slave reaches such a point where he is in complete obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so he only does that thing which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded, and he does not do that thing which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited and warned against, why is there any reason? So this is a rational thing. Is there any reason to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the Rabb and the Rahim and the Kareem, the generous and the merciful, why could He not fulfill the desire of the slave? If the slave is spending all of his time fulfilling the desire and the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and being in obedience to His will, why could not the Lord, who is merciful and generous, fulfill the desire of the slave? بل هو أولى. In fact, that is more likely that the Lord would fulfill the desire of the slave. لأن العبد مع لؤمه وعجزه لما فعل كل ما يريده الله ويأمر به فلأن يفعل الرب الرحيم مرة واحدة ما أراده العبد كان أولى. Because the slave is full of deficiencies, full of weaknesses, but he's making this effort to fulfill the will of his Lord. It's it stands more to reason that the Lord, who has that power to do anything He pleases, would fulfill some of the desires or wishes of His slave. ولهذا قال تعالى أوفوا بعهدي أوفوا بعهدكم. And he says in this meaning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, Awfu bi ahdi, Awfu bi ahdikum. Fulfill my covenant, I will fulfill my promise. Yeah. So that's the first proof. He's given a reasonable proof. There's no reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not manifest some karamat in terms of fulfilling his slaves' wishes. You know. الحجة الثالثة لو امتنع إظهار الكرامة لكان ذلك إما لأجل أن الله ليس أهلا لأن يفعل مثل هذا الفعل أو لأجل أن المؤمن ليس أهلا لأن يؤتيه الله هذه العطية. This is a second rational proof. If we say that it's not possible for karamat to take place, this can be only for one of two reasons. One is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is not befitting of Allah, or Allah is not capable even of doing this action. Yeah. Or the second reason could be because that the believer himself is not qualified, or is not what do you call it, deserving, yeah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should give him this gift. There's only two possibilities. وَالْأَوَّلْ قَدْحٌ فِي قُدْرَةِ اللَّهِ وَكُفْرٌ. The first thing is kufr, because you're saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't have the actual ability or the power to do this thing, you know, this thing which is a miraculous event, you know. And that's kufr, because we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the ability and the power to do anything that is rationally possible. To do anything that is rationally possible. Why do we say that? You probably know that from your aqidah, that the Muslim theologians had this very beautiful, precise statement, you know, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the power to do anything that is rationally possible. In other words, there are some things which are rationally impossible. And the qudra of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be linked to those things. There are some things which are rationally impossible. And this was one of the great things that our theologians did, because it puts to sleep straight away some of these quite ridiculous type of refutations that some atheists or, you know, disbelievers bring. And some people get confused by them and don't know how to respond, because in our aqidah we never said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the power to do everything. Although we can say that as a shorthand, and that is in the Quran, you know, huwa qadirun ala kulli shay, he is able to do everything. So we can say that, and he is able to do everything, but the theologians added, just to explain further there, everything that is rationally possible. Okay? Anything that is rationally possible. Because there are some things which are rationally impossible. For example, the non-existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is rationally impossible. Yeah? The non-existence of a God is rationally impossible. Or that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala power can be limited, or his knowledge could be limited. Those things are rationally impossible. Yeah? Because they go against those things which are definitely known for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What we call wajib aqlan, you know, they're necessarily rationally. Because the very definition of the ilah, the very definition of God, is that he's of unlimited power and his knowledge is infinite and so on. So those are the type of things. So in other words, you know, if someone comes along and says to you, oh, you say that you know, God can do anything, could he create a rock that he could not lift himself, for example? You know, those type of things. Or could he create a four-sided triangle? Yeah. They're just sort of nonsensical statement. The first one is to do with the qudra of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, so Allah's power can't be limited. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His qudra, His power is not linked to something impossible. So it's not linked to, for example, Him being non-existent. You know. So that's how, in terms of adab, how we phrase when talking about these aspects. Yeah? Out of adab, that's how we phrase it. So we don't say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot do something. We just say that His qudra, His power is not linked to those things which are rationally impossible. Yeah? Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, yeah. It's a good question. Allah Alam. I'm not sure about that precisely. You know. It's possible. You could argue that it's something rationally impossible. You know, for God to come in the form of a limited being that is weak and, you know, all of that things. It's possible. You could argue that, but Allah Alam. Okay, so that's what he's saying here, that you know, if you say that karamat are not possible, either you're saying because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot do that, which is then kufr, because you're limiting the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything that is rationally possible, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can do. You know. So for example, you know, someone walking on water is rationally possible. Is rationally possible. So it's within the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do that. Yeah. والثاني باطل فإن معرفة ذات الله وصفاته وفعله وأحكامه وأسمائه ومحبة الله وطاعته والمواظبة على ذكر تقديسه وتمجيده وتهليله أشرف من إعطاء رغيف واحد مفازة أو تسخير حية. أو أسد. So the second one was, if we say, okay, so within the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the believer is not deserving of being given this karama, he said this is also not true, because the believers are given something much, much more greater than that. You know, and what they're given is the ma'rifah, knowledge of the that of Allah, the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowledge of His attributes, knowledge of His af'al. When he says knowledge of the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he means the knowledge that we have of the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a negation. It's only a negation. We can't really have positive knowledge of the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because it's unknowable to us. But we can have negations such as Laysa kamithlihi shay, there is nothing like Him. That is knowledge about the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it negates anything that is like Him. Yeah. And knowledge of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the knowledge of His actions, the knowledge of His ahkam, His rulings, and His names, and love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and being in a state of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and doing dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of these things that the human beings have been given are far greater than these type of karamat that may happen. He says, such as being given a loaf of bread when you're in the desert, you know, as a rizq, or being given power over a snake or a lion or something like that. You know, these are sort of karamat that people can have. He said that's nothing compared to these things that human beings have been given. You know, that's nothing. فلما أعطي المعرفة والمحبة والذكر والشكر من غير سؤال فلأن يعطيه رغيفا في مفازة فأي بعد فيه. So he says, rhetorical question. He says, if someone is given ma'rifah, knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mahabba, love of the divine, dhikr, shukr, without even asking for it, then what is so difficult to believe that he could be given a loaf of bread when he's in a desert, in a miraculous way? Yeah. Al-Hujjatu Thalitha, the third proof. قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم حكاية عن رب العزة. The reason why he's going into such an extensive, because obviously this was a live issue historically, because the Mu'tazilites were people who denied that karamat could take place at the hands of awliya. They said this is only restricted to the prophets. So this is why he's going into quite a long discussion. And there are people today amongst Muslims, sectors of Muslims, that have taken on the Mu'tazilite deviancy. Yeah, because the Mu'tazilites were rationalists that believed in philosophy and Greek sciences, and they sometimes put that above revelation. That was the main difference we classically say between Ahl Sunnah and the Mu'tazili. Mu'tazilite would prefer reason over revelation, and Ahl Sunnah prefer revelation over reason. It's a simplification, but that was the basic type of idea. So amongst Muslims today, we have these type of people still, that have taken that deviancy, arising from the last century, where there was a great apologetic response from some sectors of Muslims towards European philosophy and rationalism, and some Muslims went quite strongly into that direction as well. So similar to what the Mu'tazilites did many centuries ago. So this may still be live. These type of issues may still be live amongst the ummah. قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم حكاية عن رب العزة. So then he says that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said in a famous hadith which is in Bukhari and other books, ما تقرب عبد إلي بمثل أداء ما افترضته عليه ولا يزال يتقرب إلي بالنوافل حتى أحبه فإذا أحببته كنت له سمعا وبصرا ولسانا وقلبا ويدا ورجلا بي يسمع وبي يبصر وبي ينطق وبي يمشي. This famous hadith, which is sahih and given in different, slightly different wordings, in that the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, my slave comes closer to me with nothing more beloved than that which I have made obligatory upon him, and then he continues to come closer to me by the nawafil, by extra acts of worship, until I love him. حتى أحبه. So this clearly shows that the rank of gaining the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a rank. It's not for every Muslim, but it's something which is achieved through ibadat, through striving and struggling and coming closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, until someone reaches that stage where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves him. And there's other hadith as well, about that, mentioning that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves a slave, then he commands Jibreel to love that slave, and then Jibreel command all of the other malaika in the heaven to love that slave. So that's a rank, a very high rank. And as the hadith explains further, that when I love him, I become his hearing and his sight and his tongue and his heart and his hand and his feet. He hears, bi yasma'u. He hears by me, and he sees by me, and he speaks by me, and he walks by me. وهذا الخبر يدل على أنه لم يبقى في سمعهم نصيب لغير الله. So how Imam al-Razi has explained this particular statement of the Prophet ﷺ. He says, this narration shows that their hearing, the hearing of these people, is completely devoted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And their sight is completely devoted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What he's saying is literally لم يبقى في سمعهم نصيب لغير الله. So their hearing, there's no nasib. Nasib is a portion, so with their hearing there's no portion given to anything apart from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. With their sight, no portion of it is given to anything apart from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, these people are in complete dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all the time. They're completely in a state of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They devote all their time to remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So nothing remains of them to be given to anything else. Their heart is given only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing remains to be given to anything else. So that's the interpretation of the meaning of the hadith according to Ar-Razi. إذ لو بقي هناك نصيب لغير الله لما قال أنه سمعه وبصره. If there was any portion of any of their limbs given to anything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet ﷺ would not have said, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not have said, I am their hearing, I am their sight. Okay? And I heard once from one Shaykh as well, such a person, Habib Umar, one of the Shaykh from Yemen, he was mentioning this hadith, and he said, such a person where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes his hearing and his sight and his tongue and everything. Imagine the state of such a person, how can such a person be fearful of anything? And in the other narration of the hadith, which is in Bukhari, it starts by saying, Man aadali waliyan faqad adhantuhu bil harb. He who shows any enmity to a wali, a friend of mine, then I declare war on him. But this is the state of these people. They're in that state that if anyone even shows enmity to them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala declares war on that person. This is one thing, once I heard from Imam Zaid Shakir as well, when I had the benefit of being in his company, when asked about, how can the victory, some people are asking something like about the victory coming to Muslims, and he said, and they were asking, what do we need to do, what's the as people ask nowadays, and he said, what we need to do is become awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you're a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will wage war on your behalf against your enemies. إذا ثبت هذا فنقول similar, once I was with Shaykh Abdul Hakim Murad driving somewhere, and I was just asking him about I said to him, Ya Shaykh, because he's like a master of theologian and aqeedah and everything. So I was asking him, Shaykh, do you think it is possible to rationally prove the existence of God? Do you think it is possible to rationally prove the existence of God? And he said, I think you can come close. You can come close. So I said to him, well, in that case, then how do you go about giving da'wah or anything, like if you want to call non-Muslims, if you're saying you can't actually rationally prove that, what's the way to give da'wah? And he said, you show them a wali, bring them to sit with the awliya, or bring them in the company of the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the da'wah. So I said to him, I said, in that case, I guess we should stop trying to like learn all these philosophy and rational proofs and try to become awliya instead. And he laughed. So that's but that's obviously a big debate, but can you rationally prove the existence of God is a big debate. And many scholars would say you can, many scholars would say you definitely can. And I personally believe you can, I think you can rationally prove that there must be a God through things like the existence of the creation, the design and the complexity in the creation, and so many other things that are there that are just totally convincing, if someone looks with an open mind. But there is also an aspect that, ultimately hidayah is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ultimately iman is a nur which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to throw into the heart of someone if he decides to guide him. So you may tell someone all of these proofs and they still would not see them, That insight, that nur has to come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inshallah, let's take a break. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala sayyidina Muhammad al-Mustafa, alhamdulillah. So just carrying on, so you mentioned about this hadith, this famous hadith Qudsi, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described the person that he loves, he becomes his hearing, his sight, etc. And he says then, إذا ثبت هذا فنقول لا شك أن هذا المقام أشرف من تسخير الحي والصبع والإيتاء الرغيف. Similarly to what he was saying before, he says, there's no doubt that someone who's on this maqam, this level, is much more a higher and noble level than doing some of these karamat, such as, putting down a snake or a wild animal, or being given some bread to eat, as a karama. وعنقود من العنب أو شربة من الماء, or being given water in a miraculous way to drink. فلما أوصل الله برحمته عبده إلى هذه الدرجات العالية فأي بؤل في أن يعطيه رغيفا واحدا أو شربة ماء في مفازة. If we're saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes the hearing, the sight, all of the limbs become completely devoted in this state to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what's so hard to believe that a person could be given a drink of water or some food in a miraculous way, in a karama? الحجة الرابعة قال عليه السلام حاكيا عن رب العزة من آذى وليا فقد بارزني بالمحاربة. The hadith we mentioned earlier in slightly different wording, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the one who harms one of my friends, wali, then he is facing me in war, And in the other one that I mentioned, فَقَدْ أَذَنْتُ بِالْحَرْبِ, I declare war on him. فَجَعَلَ إِذَاءَ الْوَلِي قَائِمًا مَقَامَ إِذَائِهِ. So harming a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like harming Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وهذا قريب من قوله تعالى إن الذين يبايعونك إنما يبايعون الله. So this is close in the meaning for the ayah of Quran in Surah Al-Fath number 10, which says, those who pledge allegiance to you, they pledge allegiance to none other than Allah. Those who pledge allegiance to you, meaning the Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, إنما يبايعون Allah, they pledge allegiance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's similar in meaning to that. وقال وما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا. And also in the Quran, it is not for any believer, male or female, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger have decided upon a matter. Yeah, so when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger have decided upon a matter, it's not for any true believer to then have any objection to that decision. وقال إن الذين يؤذون الله ورسوله لعنهم الله في الدنيا والآخرة. Those who harm Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger. So this is, obviously the ennobling of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it's similar in meaning to that, the one who declares war on or harms my wali. So the one who harms the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if anyone harms Allah and His Messenger, obviously they can't harm Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but those who harm His Messenger, it's as if they're harming Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لَعَنَهُمُ اللَّهُ فِي الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has cursed them in this world and in the akhirah. So the harm that is coming to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is the result of that, the la'na, the cursing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah protect us from His punishment. فجعل بيعة محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم بيعة مع الله ورضاه محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم رضاء الله. So in these ayahs of Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made the bay'ah with Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the bay'ah with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and pleasing the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the pleasing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and harming the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the harming of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in these ayahs of Quran. فلا جرم كانت درجة محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم أعلى الدرجات إلى أبلغ الغايات. There's no doubt that the rank of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم is the highest of all ranks and the limit of all limits. فكذا ها هنا لما قال من آذى لي وليا. It says similarly here when it says in the hadith, the one who harms one of my walis, one of my wali. دل ذلك على أنه تعالى جعل إيذاء الولي قائما مقام إيذاء نفسه. This shows us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put the harming of one of His awliya on the status of harming him. ويتأكد هذا بالخبر المشهور أنه تعالى يقول, and he says this is also strengthened by the well-known hadith in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يوم القيامة مرضت فلم تعودني. Very famous narration which is sahih, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say on the day of judgment to certain people, I was sick but you did not visit me. I was sick but you did not visit me. استسقيتك فما سقيتني. I asked you for drink but you did not give me to drink. استطعمتك فما أطعمتني. I asked you for food and you did not give me to food. فيقول يا ربي كيف أفعل هذا وأنت رب العالمين. The person will reply to him, how could I do these things? How could I feed you or drink you? You are the Rabbul Alameen, you are the Lord of the worlds. فيقول إن عبدي فلانا مرض ولم تعده. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say, my so-and-so slave was sick but you did not visit him. أما علمت أنك لو أدته لو وجدت ذلك عندي. Did you not know that if you had visited you would have found that with me? So similarly with the drinking and the eating, etc. فدلت هذه الأخبار على أن أولياء الله يبلغون إلى هذه الدرجات. So all of these proofs show us that the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have reached these high ranks. فأي بؤن في أن يعطيه الله كسوة خبز. So what is it so far-fetched to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may give such a person a loaf of bread or a drink of water as a karama? أو يسخر له كلبا أو وردا. Or he may, subjugate for such a person a ferocious dog or a ferocious lion. Why is that so difficult to believe, like in the story of Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, that he took the lion by the ear and led him off the road? Why should we find that difficult to believe when these are these type of people? that are awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. الحجة الخامسة أن نشاهد في العرف أن من خصه هو الملك بالخدمة الخاصة وأذن له في الدخول عليه في مجلس الأنس فقد يخصه أيضا بأن يقدره على ما لا يقدر عليه غيره. He says also we can just know by normal customs amongst human beings, just using our reason once again. If you look amongst human beings, if you see that there's a king or a great leader, and there's certain people that are allowed to come close to him and his special servants, they're allowed to serve him in that special way. Traditionally these kings, they used to have that, no one can come within a certain distance. So Kaaba Qawsain they used to call it. I think the Persian kings, they had this thing, Kaaba Qawsain, that no one can come within 2 bows lengths of the king, of the emperor. Kaaba Qawsain. Qawsain is 2 bows, bows, those bows that use firing arrows. So no one was permitted to come within that distance of the king or the emperor, apart from his very close people, like his close family or the ones that were very close friends to him. So that's why it says in the Quran, وَكَانَ قَابَ قَوْسَيْنَ وَأَدْنَى, referring to the Prophet ﷺ. And there's some difference of opinion about what it refers to, but many said it refers to the Mi'raj, when the Prophet ﷺ came into the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he was قَابَ قَوْسَيْنَ أَوْ أَدْنَى, he was 2 bows lengths or closer. Meaning, it's symbolic, it means that he was allowed into that, the space that no one's allowed into with the king unless they're very close. So it says we can see that these people who are close to these important people, so the king will allow him into his personal space, but the king will also then give that person extra things, extra gifts, or he will ennoble him in different ways that other people aren't allowed to be, things that other people are not allowed to do, he will allow them to do. بل العقل السليم يشهد بأنه متى حصل ذلك القرب فإنه يتبعه هذه المناصب. He says anyone with a sound mind can just clearly see that, when someone gets to that level of closeness to a king, or the king, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even, then what comes with that is a certain rank and a certain status, manasib, a certain thing where they are given certain extra things from the king. فجعل القرب أصلا والمنصب تبعا. The asal, the actual, the foundational matter is the qurb, the closeness to the king, and the extra, the mansib or the extra status comes as a result of being close to the king. وَعَظَمُ الْمُلُوكِ هُوَ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ, and the greatest of all kings is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord and Master of all the universes. He is the greatest of all kings. فإذا شرف عبدا بأنه أوصله إلى عتبات خدمته ودرجات كرامته. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the greatest of all kings, has honored the slave, that this slave is one of his special, servants that serves him and is doing ibadah of him. وأوقفه على أسرار معرفته, and he has given this slave the secrets of his ma'rifah, the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the living knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this ma'rifah, this knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is not the one you can get from books. This ma'rifah is not one you get from studying aqeedah. It's not one you get from studying, what are the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This ma'rifah is the one they're talking about, is the one that comes into the heart, that is a light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it only comes through having sincerity and mujahada and struggling and striving in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ibadah. So he has given this, ennobled the slave with all of this ma'rifah and so on. وَرَفَعَ حُجَبَ الْبُعْدِ بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَ نَفْسِهِ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has lifted the veils of distance from this slave, and so he's close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As it mentioned in the hadith, وَمَا تَقَرَّبَ إِلَيَّ. So the slave comes closer and closer. There's qurb, there's a closeness. It's not a physical distance, but it's in meaning, in the essence of the meaning of closeness, you know. وَأَجْلَسُ عَلَى بِسَاطِ قُرْبِهِ. This slave has, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put him close to himself. فَأَيُّ بُؤْنٍ فِي أَنْ يُظْهِرَ بَعْضَ تِلْكَ الْكَرَامَاتِ. So what's so difficult to believe that some karamat, these miracles can happen at the hand of such a person? في هذا العالم مع أن كل هذا العالم بالنسبة إلى ذرة من تلك السعادات الروحانية. What is so amazing that some sort of worldly type of karamat can happen, some worldly type of thing, whereas what that slave has got in terms of his spiritual gain is much greater than all of this whole world put together. You know, these spiritual delights and happinesses that he has from coming close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Any of these small, these things we might consider to be miracles, material things, physical things, is nothing compared to that. Yeah. الحجة السادسة لا شك أن المتولى للأفعال هو الروح لا البدن ولا شك أن معرفة الله تعالى للروح كالروح للبدن على ما قررناه في تفسير قوله تعالى I'm just trying to remember how to pronounce that from this ayah of Quran. ينزل الملائكة بالروح من أمره. So he says, there's no doubt that the entity or the essence within the human being that is responsible for actions is the ruh, is the soul, not the badan, not the body. And I mentioned this in the Sunday dars for some people who were there, but I'll just reiterate that one of the important things to remember is the word ruh, the soul, is the same thing as now what psychologists call the mind or the psyche. It's the same thing but with a different name. Yeah, the mind, the psyche, the ego, all of these terms are now used by psychologists, but in the past was called ruh, qalb, aql, intellect, soul, heart. It's exactly the same thing. There's no difference between the two. They're talking about the same thing. And so you have this big debate amongst psychologists, scientists, philosophers about, is there a difference between the mind and the body, or the mind and the brain? Some very sort of die-hard biologists or scientists, they say there's absolutely no difference between the brain and the mind, and there is no such thing really as mind. It's just brain, it's just neurons firing around, but it's not convincing at all, and many philosophers, because this is where science meets philosophy when you start talking about these type of aspects, of what is mind, and the crux of it is what we call conscious experience or consciousness. That's the crux of the matter. What is consciousness? Because in other words, we as human beings, we experience things. We're not like a computer. If you have a computer could have all sorts of wires and connections and things firing around, electric impulses firing around. A computer can even have an eye, like a camera. It can see an image, but the computer is not experiencing anything, is it, subjectively? Yeah, it's not a conscious being. That's the crux of the difference, and that's a mystery, and scientists can't really explain that. What is consciousness? So that's why this big debate about the mind. What is the mind? But this is what we used to call ruh. So computer, no matter how complex, it doesn't. Would you say the computer is experiencing something? Does it feel pleasure? Does it feel pain? You could give a computer pain receptors like we have. We have pain receptors, right? We could give a computer the same nerves, wire them up to its like CPU or whatever. So if you smash the computer screen, it will get those neurons will start firing. But will the computer feel pain? Does it experience pain? No, of course not. Why? Because it doesn't have consciousness. It's not a conscious being. And don't get confused between consciousness and conscience, which is a totally different thing. We're talking about consciousness, which is a subjective awareness. You are a person. This is the ultimate gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us as human beings. It is life itself. This is what we call life itself. This is life. You are a perceiving being. You feel things. You have a subjective reality. So this is the ultimate thing that we've been given. And a really interesting thing as well, just related to that, for people who are interested in science or physics. If you look into quantum mechanics, quantum theory, quantum mechanics is the study of extremely small particles, that the universe is made up of. So in quantum physics, they look at not just atoms, but they look at the things that atoms are made up of. So you talk about extremely mind-bogglingly small things. What they call quarks or things like that. And the really amazing thing they found, I really encourage people to read up about this, is, when they look at these very, very tiny particles that the whole universe is made up of, what they found is some really strange findings. And scientists have been completely sort of shocked, don't know what to make of it. Physicists, they don't know how to handle the findings that they found. Which is that these particles, and in fact all particles in the universe, can exist in what they call a wave form. They exist in various possibilities at the same time. They exist in various possibilities at the same time. And the only way that the waveform or the particle resorts to one particular possibility out of the multiple possibilities, or the range of possibilities, the only way it falls down to one is when you have a conscious observer. Of that particle. So this is something really bizarre that physicists have discovered, because they've basically come across the ruh. They've come across the ruh in this quantum theory, and this is established. Quantum physics is not like an opinion of certain obscure physicists or something like this. This is like established what quantum physics has found. And they're really just scratching their heads to think, how can this be the case? This is famously illustrated by this concept they call Schrodinger's cat. I don't know if people have heard of it or not. Anyone heard of that? The cat in the box. Yeah, you probably heard me mention it before. Read up about Schrodinger's cat. Basically, Schrodinger was one of these quantum physicists, one of the leading people of his time. And he just found this thing so bizarre, that they had found that a particle is in multiple different states at the same time, which seems something you'd think is impossible. And it only falls into a particular state when you actually observe it, when you have a conscious observer. He found this so bizarre and found so implausible that he illustrated it how ridiculous it is by an example, which is called Schrodinger's cat. So he said, imagine this quantum particle was inside a box, a sealed box, and inside that sealed box you have a cat, and inside the sealed box you have a radioactive particle, radioactive. So with radioactive elements, you probably know they decay, and they have half-lives and all of that. But with one particular radioactive particle, you don't know when it's going to decay. So there's a 50-50 chance both ways. And he said the radioactive particle is attached to some poison or something. So if it decays, the poison is released and the cat dies. When the radioactive particle decays, poison is released, the cat dies. According to quantum mechanics or quantum theory, the radioactive particle is in both states at the same time. It is decayed and it is not decayed. It is in both states at the same time. So he said, look, this is just, So in other words, the cat, in consequence, the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. The cat is both alive and dead at the same time, and that's what's called Schrodinger's cat. The illustration. He was trying to show, look, this is bizarre. How can this be true? But this is what quantum mechanics is showing, and it's quite a strongly proven theory. The whole quantum theory is quite a lot of evidence to back it up. A lot of things have proven that it will be true. So the cat is alive and dead at the same time until someone actually opens a box and looks at the cat. At that point, it falls into one of the two states, either dead or alive. So that idea that you have to have the conscious observer to see the cat, you see what I mean? Because consciousness, that is ruh. Consciousness. To have a conscious observer, that is what ruh is. That is the essence of ruh. Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah mentioned that. That what is the essence? What is the ruh? What is the soul? In essence, he said, it is this idea of consciousness. In Arabic terms, they call it irada, will. What we call will. Because if you're not a conscious being, you have no will. Like a computer has no will of its own. A computer will only do what you program it. It will never ever do anything of its own will. You could have the most complex supercomputer in the world. You leave it in a room, it will not do anything. It doesn't have a free will. You know what I mean? So that's the ruh. That's the essence of ruh. So that's why these scientists, they have in this amazing way, in the real the cutting edge of physics, they've come across the ruh, and they really, there's a big debate now about this amongst physicists, philosophers, because once again, this is where science meets philosophy. Because when you start talking about consciousness, conscious observers, it's sort of outside the realm of science. So I think it's really profound. I think it's a real big proof of our belief, because what really they're saying is you have to have a conscious observer, and the ultimate conscious observer is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is why the universe is in one particular state out of infinite probabilities. You might have heard people talk about this multiverse, or infinite parallel universes. That has arisen from this particular quantum theory problem, because they're saying, why is the universe in one particular state? So they're saying there must be infinite different possibilities, and we are just in one of those infinite different possibilities. If you think about it, all they're doing really is describing one of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that our theologians described 1,000 years ago. That is an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because within His knowledge is all the infinite different possibilities, and it's through His will that only this one is actually reality. You know. So that's something I think of real interest in physics, and Muslims should you know, read about that stuff. Okay, inshallah, we're going back to where we were. There's another funny quote by you know, Richard Hawkins, the physicist from Cambridge, the one who's in a wheelchair. Stephen Hawking, sorry, yeah, Stephen Hawkins. He's an agnostic, you know. Yeah, the other guy, Dawkins, is an atheist, but Hawkins is an agnostic. He said he had a funny thing about Schrodinger's cat. He said, whenever Schrodinger's cat is mentioned, I want to pull out my gun, because it's such a, you know, a bizarre thing for them. Has he? Bad choice, man. Inshallah ta'ala, Allah make him a Muslim. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, so he's saying the ruh is the thing which controls our actions, because that's our conscious, you know, where we decide we want to do this or we want to do this, not the body. So he says an interesting point here you might have to reflect upon. He says there's no doubt that the ma'rifah of Allah to the soul, the ma'rifah of Allah, the knowledge of Allah to the soul, is the same, similar to the relation of the soul to the body. The relationship of ma'rifah of Allah to the soul is like the relationship of the soul to the body. Yeah? And he says we have explained this in more detail in the tafsir of this other ayah, Surah An-Naml, number 20. يُنَزِّلُ الْمَلَائِكَةَ بِالرُّوحِ مِنْ أَمْرِهِ. وقال عليه السلام أبيت عند ربي يطعمني ويسقيني. And the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, I spend the night with my Lord, he gives me to eat and drink. You know, when the Prophet ﷺ stopped the Sahaba from fasting continuously day after day, he said, no, you must break the fast. But they said to him, but you do that, you fast continuously. And he said, my Lord feeds me and drinks me. This is where Fakhruddin al-Razi is mentioning this. You know, so that's you know, the Prophet ﷺ saying, my Lord feeds me and gives me to drink. ولهذا المعنى نرى أن كل من كان أكثر علما بأحوال عالم الغيب كان أقوى قلبا وأقل ضعفا. ولهذا قال علي بن أبي طالب كرم الله وجهه والله ما قلعت باب خيبر بقوة جسدانية ولكن بقوة ربانية. So he's saying here, you know, there is a certain faculty called the ruh which can have a lot of power. You know, the ruh of the human being, the spirit, can become very powerful. And he mentioned, you know, the Prophet ﷺ saying, my Lord feeds me and gives me to drink. So this is like a spiritual power, isn't it? You know? And he says, you know, we see that if someone becomes more and more knowledgeable of the states of the unseen, his heart, his ruh becomes stronger, his spirit becomes stronger. And he said, in this meaning, Ali ibn Abi Talib karamallahu wajha said, by Allah, I did not pick up the door of Khaybar with my bodily strength, but it was through a divine strength or a lordly strength, quwwa rabbaniyya, a lordly strength. If you remember the story when Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu was given the command of the Muslim army against Khaybar, and there was the Sahaba reported they saw him carrying the door of the fortress, the door of Khaybar, on his back, And afterwards, after the battle, they tried to lift it up, and they required many people to just lift it up, and they had seen him carrying it by himself. So this is what he said, you know, it wasn't my bodily, it wasn't my physical strength that was carrying that door. وذلك لأن عليا كرم الله وجهه في ذلك الوقت انقطع نظره عن عالم الأجساد. He said at that time, Imam al-Razi says, at that time, Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu anhu, he was no longer, his sight was no longer connected to our physical world, the world of physical flesh and bodies. وأشرقت الملائكة بأنوار عالم الكبرياء. Yeah, so at that time he was in a spiritual state. You know, his nazar was not in our normal physical realm. He was in a different state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah. And he said the angels, the malaika at that time were sort of shining lights of the other world upon him. Yeah. فَتَقْوَى رُوحُهُ, his spirit became extremely strong, you know. وَتَشَبَّهَ بِجَوَاهِرِ الْأَرْوَاحِ الْمَلَكِيَّةِ, his ruh at that time became like the souls of the malaika. Yeah. وَتَلَأْلَأَتْ فِيهِ أَضْوَاءُ عَالَمِ الْقُدْسِ وَالْعَظَمَةِ. He is a very eloquent type of Arabic here, you know, to describe this this karama that happened to Sayyidina Ali. So he said, you know, the lights of the I don't know how to translate that, Alam al-Qudsi wal-Azama, the lordly realm, the divine realm, the lights of the divine realm was sparkling upon him. فَلَا جَرَمَ حَسُلَ لَهُ مِنَ الْقُدْرَةِ مَا قَدْرَ بِهَا. So he says, no doubt that he would have got this strength in such a state. Beautiful way he's describing that in the Arabic. مَا قَدْرَ بِهَا عَلَى مَا لَمْ يَقْدِرْ عَلَيْهِ غَيْرُهُ. At that moment he had the strength to do things that no one else had the strength to do. وَكَذَلِكَ الْأَبْدُ إِذَا وَاظَبَ عَلَى الطَّاعَاتِ. So he says, just like this, you know, if you have any servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is persisting upon obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, بَلَغَ إِلَى الْمَقَامِ الَّذِي يَقُولُ اللَّهُ كُنْتُ لَهُ سَمْعًا وَبَصَرًا. He can reach that rank, that maqam where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am his hearing and his sight. فَإِذَا صَارَ نُورُ جَلَالِ اللَّهِ سَمْعًا لَهُ. When the light of the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes his hearing, سَمِعَ الْقَرِيبَ وَالْبَعِيدَ, he can hear what is close to him and he can hear what is far away from him. In other words, these karamat can happen, he could hear something far away from him. وَإِذَا صَارَ ذَلِكَ النُّورُ بَصَرًا. And you know, this relates back to Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu. You remember the karama they mentioned of Sayyidina Umar when he was on the mimbar and he heard and saw the army which was very, very far away in a different country. And he was able to see what was happening and hear it, and he was able to speak and they heard his voice. So this is what he's alluding back to, you know. وَإِذَا صَارَ ذَلِكَ النُّورُ بَصَرًا لَهُ رَأَى الْقَرِيبَ وَالْبَعِيدَ. When that light, that divine light becomes his sight, he's able to see what is close and far away from him. وَإِذَا صَارَ ذَلِكَ النُّورُ يَدًا لَهُ قَدْرَ لَا تَصَرُّفِ فِي الصَّعْبِ وَالسَّهْلِ وَالْبَعِيدِ وَالْقَرِيبِ. When that light, that divine light becomes his hand and his limbs, he's able to do things which are more difficult and which are easy and which are far and which are near. So we'll leave it there, inshallah. We'll continue next week, inshallah. Hopefully, I'm hoping we'll finish this section on karamat next week, so we can go into the tafsir of the next ayat, inshallah ta'ala. جزا الله عنا سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم ما هو أهله. جزا الله عنا سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم ما هو أهله. جزا الله عنا سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم ما هو أهله. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله.